All right, I think we are live. Welcome, everybody, back to the second episode of our book club today. Oops, sorry, looks like I'm getting a little echo. Okay, that should be good. So, in tonight's episode, we are going to be studying The Populist Delusion by Neema Parvini. Now, The Populist Delusion is a book which attempts to explain how power functions in reality. Essentially, what the populist delusion as an idea is it is the idea that people are sovereign and that their elected representatives make policy based on what they want. And this is the idea that Parvini will attack throughout the book. So Neema Parvini's thesis is that an organized minority will always rule over the disorganized majority, and that social change is always top down and elite driven rather than driven by the people. The book focuses on 8 thinkers who caused Parvini to arrive at this conclusion. Each chapter is dedicated to a particular thinker, and each thinker has about one or two ideas, salient ideas, which Parvini focuses on and which he explains in his chapters. So before he gets into his first thinker, Parvini also discusses what he calls the 4 myths of liberalism, which are addressed by several of the thinkers listed in the book. And so he lays this out in the book's first chapter. So without any further ado, let's get into the 4 myths of liberalism, and then we'll address each of the thinkers Parvini writes about. So the 4 myths of liberalism, as he outlines them, are the myth of the stateless society, which is the idea that the state and society were or could ever be separate. The myth of the neutral state, which is the idea that the state and policy were or could ever be separate. The third one is the myth of the free market, which is the idea that the state and the economy were or could ever be separate. And the fourth one is the myth of the separation of power. And that's the idea that competing power centers can realistically endure without converging. So these are the 4 false ideas which Parvini calls the 4 myths of liberalism. The reasons why these are false, let's dive into each of these in turns. So for the myth of the stateless society, we have to recognize that humans are political animals. What is called the state is merely an expression of the fact, sorry, I can't read my own handwriting, I'll start again. What is called the state is merely an expression of the fact that there must be a political entity within society. Power will always seek to consolidate. Thus, those who desire to create a stateless society are merely, I can't speak tonight. Thus, the idea to create a stateless society is the unattainable dream of anarchists. So that one's pretty self-explanatory. If you're going to have a society, you're going to have a state, and anarchy is really impossible. That's pretty much the takeaway from that one. The second myth is the myth of the neutral society, and that is wrong-headed because a state will always have to deal with internal and external political disputes. Differences of opinion on policy will always exist as different factions vie for the levers of power. Thus, the state can never be politically neutral. The third one is the myth of the free market, and this is wrong-headed because economic questions will always converge with the realm of the political. Competing political factions and ideologies will always be incentivized to influence or outright manage the economy. Thus, a free market independent from the tether of politics is merely a fiction which libertarians think is real. And the last one, the myth of the separation of powers. This is wrong-headed because it is the tendency of power to centralize. Over time, competing political forces will attempt to accrue more power for itself, or themselves, rather. This happened even in the United States. Although we have a constitution that explicitly outlines a separation of powers, over the course of American history, power tended to converge and consolidate, particularly in certain branches of government. We can look at presidents like Abraham Lincoln, who consolidated power to the executive branch, Woodrow Wilson, and probably the most famous one would be FDR, who really he assumed the role of an American dictator, frankly. He consolidated way more power than the founding fathers ever wanted the president to have, and the Constitution was impotent to stop it. What's up, Wigger? Hi, Solaris. Okay, so those are the four myths of liberalism. Let's get into the first chapter of the book. And this chapter focuses on Gaetano Mosca. So Gaetano Mosca is regarded as the father of Italian elite theory. He wrote the book called The Ruling Class. And the two ideas which Gaetano Mosca contributes to the Populist Delusion are called the rulers and the ruled and political formulas. So let's deal with each of these in turn. What is the idea of the rulers and the ruled? Essentially, this is the idea that all societies are divided into two classes, an organized minority that rules and the disorganized masses who are ruled. This idea intrinsically rejects popular sovereignty and says that decision-making for a country is done by its elites rather than by the populace. Those who have the will to assert their worldview and who have the intellectual, moral, economic, and material means to enforce it will command policy. So I don't think that's really a hard, I don't have any problems with this idea. It does seem like there are two classes, an elite class and then pretty much everyone else. And in theory, a republic is supposed to involve electing representatives to push your ideas on the national scale, but that is not how things work in reality. In reality, the elites will always lobby these representatives. They may outright be these representatives, and the people really have no power, and democracy is really just a fiction. So the second idea, which Mosca talks about, is called political formulas. These are also called principles of sovereignty, but I like the term political formulas better. Essentially, these are the legal and moral basis on which the power of the ruling class rests. In medieval times, the political formula of the European monarchies was the divine right of kings. So when asked why they should be in power, they would say that a monarch would say that it's God's will that a king rules this country. Today, though, we don't have the divine right of kings. In modern times, the political formula that governs the United States is essentially the Civil Rights Act. We live in a society which sees egalitarianism and anti-fascism as the greatest goods possible. Parvini specifically calls the political formula that governs us the boomer truth. And so, yeah, we are living in a society ruled by a political formula that is hostile to its population, particularly to white Americans. And the same is unfortunately also true in Europe at the current time. So that's essentially what Mosca contributes to the populist delusion, but he is not the only Italian elite theorist that Parvini writes about. There are two others, and let's go into the second one, who is named Vilfredo Pareto. So Vilfredo Pareto was a mathematician. He shared the core ideas of Italian elite theory with Mosca, but despite this, both he and Gaetano Mosca hated each other. Pareto was a renowned economist and mathematician in his own right, and he saw himself as Mosca's equal, but Mosca saw himself as the sole father of Italian elite theory. Vilfredo Pareto wrote a book called The Mind and Society, which is this giant 1,000-page tome. And in it, he has some points of differentiation from Mosca's ideology. Pareto's analysis places a greater emphasis on economics and psychology than Gaetano Mosca does. And Pareto is more cold, he's more value neutral and amoral in his analysis than Mosca. So even though they agree on most things, the salient idea which Vilfredo Pareto puts forth is called the circulation of elites. So with Pareto, it's important to recognize that he essentially classified human beings into roughly 40 different archetypes, a little bit more than 40 actually. But even though he has this complicated system, we can essentially boil them down to two groups. And these overlap with what Machiavelli called the foxes and the lions. Foxes are people who are adept at persuasion. They are good at manipulating people. They are tricksy with their words. And importantly, they have a distaste for violence and they can't use hard power effectively. Lions are kind of the opposite. They're strong, they're head forth, they're willing to use power, they're willing to use violence, but they're not very conniving, they're not very cunning, and they can easily be outmaneuvered by someone who's smarter at politics. So the circulation of elites is essentially the idea that at any time, a government will be more composed of one group or the other. You could have a more fox occupied government, or you could have a more lion occupied government. It's worth noting that liberals tend to be foxes while conservatives tend to be lions, but this is not an absolute thing. This is just something Pareto observed. So when you have foxes in power, they're very good at acquiring power through manipulation and through politicking, but they're very bad at using hard force. And so when it becomes necessary to use hard force, that's when there can be a circulation of elites where lions replace the foxes and come to occupy more roles in government. Conversely, lions are really good during war times, but during peacetime, it's very easy for the foxes to outmaneuver them and to acquire power for themselves at the expense of the lions. Pareto's idea of the circulation of elites is that there will always be a circulation. You can't have an indefinite period of fox occupied governments or lion occupied governments, and eventually this will change and one side will take over from the others. It's worth noting to say that right now we live in a fox occupied government. So if Pareto is correct, eventually this will be replaced by lions. Now, the other Italian elite theorist that Parvini writes about is named Robert Michels. Robert Michels was a German, but he studied in Italy under Gaetano Mosca. And in 1911, he wrote the book called Political Parties. His salient idea is the idea called the iron law of oligarchy. And essentially, this says that if you have an organization, it's going to be ruled by a few people. There is no such thing as a democratic organization because inevitably it will devolve into oligarchy. So there are 5 reasons why Robert Michels thought this was the case. The first 2 are psychological. And this applies not just to organizations, it applies to any organized group, really. It could be a state, an empire, a kingdom, or it could be something like a corporation, even a church, even something as small as a chess club. Robert Michels believed that all of these were susceptible to the iron law of oligarchy. So back to the 5 reasons why this is the case. The first one is that Robert Michels observed that the masses have a psychological need to be led. I don't think there's much to dispute here, as most humans are followers. They want someone to lead them. The second factor Robert Michels talks about is the allure of power. And essentially, the allure of having power motivates a director to consolidate power around himself. So someone may start out with noble intentions of only working for the group, but as he gets a taste of power, it's very common for him to come to want more of it and to accrue power specifically in his own person. This is kind of like Lord Acton's adage of absolute power corrupts absolutely. So the other three factors why the iron law of oligarchy is truly iron, these are more practical factors. The third one is when dealing with organizations that have a large membership, holding referenda for each decision becomes practically impossible. If you're a political party, for example, you can't poll each of your members to decide what your party should do for every little decision. You may come to a consensus on some bigger ones, but it's just impractical to do that constantly every day and on every issue. So the fourth factor Michels talks about is that organizations require administrative work to be done, and not everyone is willing to do this, nor is everyone capable of doing this. So the directors who rule the rest of the people in the organization, they're going to be the people who are both capable and willing to do this. So someone who's just in an organization who doesn't want a leadership role, they'll kind of abdicate the responsibility for administrative duties to the people who want to do that. And the people who want to do that are more likely to become directors. And then the fifth point Michels talks about is that the masses simply cannot organize. They're too large and they're too disparate in opinions. They have their own lives to attend to. Usually their interest is not solely in that organization. They might think, oh, what's for dinner tonight? And just stuff as mundane and trivial as that. And so most people are not motivated to organize, and therefore they won't. So those are the three Italian elite theorists that make up Parvini's first few chapters. And the next thinker he talks about is named Carl Schmitt. I've done a few videos about Carl Schmitt, I believe. Carl Schmitt was a National Socialist political theorist, and he wrote two important books. One of them is called Political Theology, and the other is called The Concept of the Political. The two ideas which we should take away from Carl Schmitt are firstly that sovereign is he who decides the exception, and we'll get into what that means shortly. And the second idea, which I've explored in its own video, is called the friend-enemy distinction. So starting with the former, sovereign is he who decides the exception is essentially saying that the person who makes decisions when a system is in crisis is the person who truly holds power. This is not always the official head of a state or the person officially in charge of an organization. It could even be a group of people who are the sovereign. But Carl Schmitt had this idea that a political system's character is truly revealed when it is in crisis and when exceptions to the rules are made. And the person who holds power is the person who decides when the exceptions are made and what those exceptions are. So that's a pretty profound thought. It may seem kind of obvious to us today, but this was really not the case when Carl Schmitt was writing. He's really had an influence on political theory, even beyond Germany at the time. You can go to college and you'll still hear liberal professors talk about Carl Schmitt. They won't endorse him because he was too based for them, but they will talk about him just because he's had such an impact on the field of political science. Now, the second idea, which Schmitt talks about, is the friend-enemy distinction. I've done a video on this before, but essentially, when he says friend, he's not talking about like your friend that you would go have drinks with. A friend is someone who is aligned with your political interests and who wants to see the identity of the groups you belong to exist. And obviously, an enemy is someone who is opposed to your political interests and the existence of your group. So politics is essentially a war over who gets to be in charge. You want friends in charge and you want enemies crushed. This is what politics fundamentally is. It's not some marketplace of ideas where the best idea wins, like a lot of normicons will try to tell you. It's about power. It's about getting your friends in power and about stopping your enemy from making policy. So with this idea, we can really see that neutrality is a lie. Everyone just wants what is good for their group, and those who don't want that are the enemies. So this is a very practical and realistic, I would say, way of looking at politics, and it's something sorely missing from the modern political sphere, especially the normie right, who I can't stand. The left wing are not our friends, they never will be, and they have to be regarded as an enemy. So that kind of wraps up Carl Schmitt, and we'll go on to the next thinker, who's a guy named Bertrand de Jouvenel. Bertrand de Jouvenel was French, and after World War II, he wrote a book called On Power, which was very popular in France, but it wasn't so popular in America. Parvini speculates that the reason for this is because de Jouvenel is a very harsh critic of democracy. He says it doesn't work, and obviously Americans would take umbrage with that. But it really, de Jouvenel is right. Democracy doesn't work. So the two concepts which de Jouvenel talks about are the high-low middle model and political castles. So high-low middle is essentially the idea that the high, which we can call central sovereign power, will ally themselves with the lowest strata of society against the middle class. We can think of today in modern society, the elites who are in charge are these left-wing Jews and whites, and they'll ally themselves with the lowest people in society who we can say are illegal immigrants, blacks, etc. And their main enemy is white America and the white middle class. De Jouvenel says that they do this because the middle class represents a threat to their power. The elite are not concerned about some proletariat rising up and eating them, like eat the rich leftists will say. No, they're concerned about the middle class organizing a counter elite and dislodging them from power. So that brings us to the second idea, which is called political castles. And this is all about power, where it is, and how to dislodge it. So a political castle is just another term for a node of power within society. It could be an institution, a part of the government, a part of the state apparatus. It might be an influential corporation, a media outlet, or even a media platform. There's a broad range of things that a political castle could be. So if we want to illustrate a good example of capturing a political castle, we can think of Twitter. So before Elon Musk took over, the guy in charge of it was an Indian named Parag Agrawal, and there were also plenty of Jews involved, such as Yoel Roth. Twitter it's not a free speech platform now, but it was much more censorious under Parag Agrawal and Yoel Roth than it is now. So when Elon Musk took over Twitter, that's an example of a castle being captured. Elon belongs to the PayPal mafia, which are these Silicon Valley tech bros. They're sort of their own faction aligned with MAGA. And the PayPal mafia took over Twitter. That was an example of them capturing a castle from these left-wing ideologues and essentially ruling it in the way they want. Obviously, we all have gripes with some of the problems with how Elon Musk runs it. He does not run it as a free speech platform. He censors the Australian nationalists like Joel Davis and Thomas Sewell. But that's not really the point. The point is that this is an example of a castle being captured. And if we want another example, we can think of the universities. They used to be staffed primarily by WASP elites. Then in the 40s and especially in the 60s, they started getting taken over by Jews. So that kind of wraps up what I wanted to talk about with Bertrand de Jouvenel. And now we'll go to the next thinker, who's a guy named James Burnham. He's interesting because James Burnham was originally an ex-Trotskyist who became a neocon. So he's obviously not on our side, but Parvini does believe that he has ideas which we should take note of. Another fun fact about this guy is that he was who the character O'Brien in 1984 was based off of, because from what we know about James Burnham, he really was this cold Machiavellian character in real life, completely amoral and just purely focused on power. So the idea which we should take away from James Burnham is the idea of managerialism. So what is managerialism? Well, essentially, Burnham's thesis was that the Marxists were wrong. There was a revolution taking place against capitalism, but it was not the proletariat who were going to overthrow the capitalist class. Instead, what Burnham argued is that a managerial class would displace the capitalists by the end of the 20th century. So, what is this managerial class? This is a class of people that operates across the public-private divide. If we want to look in government, examples of managers would be bureaucrats, all the people who are civil servants. They're appointed to these three-letter agencies. They're not elected. They really manage the government institutions with little accountability. But they're not the sole people who make up the managerial class. In the private sector, you also have managers in corporations. So a CEO and board members, according to Burnham, these would be examples of managers, as well as people like HR representatives and stuff like that. So why is a CEO considered a manager, whereas a capitalist is not? Essentially, there are a few differences which we need to talk about. In capitalism, the pursuit of profits are the goal of the person in charge of the company. But in managerialism, it's all about bettering one's own individual position within the company. So this will result in managers making decisions that are economically adverse and bad for the company, but they'll do it so long as it accrues more power for themselves. This contrasts with capitalism, where if you're someone like Rockefeller or Henry Ford, you're going to make decisions on what's best for your company's bottom line. You own the company, so you're not worried about power. You're worried about your company existing and thriving. Moreover, managers are also fungible. It's very hard to dislodge a true capitalist, a person who owns his company and runs it like a monarch. It's kind of inconceivable that the people in Ford cars would be able to overthrow Henry Ford from his own company and take power for themselves. But in managerialism, it's very easy to fire a manager. CEOs can get fired if they don't meet quarterly expectations. Sorry, I can't speak. The board is very powerful. They can decide if a particular manager in the company is doing a good job or not. And the key thing we need to focus on is just how fungible they are. They can be replaced very easily. This is not the same in a company like Ford Motor Cars or Rockefeller Standard Oil. So Burnham really saw the revolution against capitalism. He disagreed with Trotsky and Marx and Lenin that it was going to be this proletariat class taking over. He saw it as the managers. And when we look around the world, it's kind of hard to dispute that he's wrong. A lot of these companies and our government institutions are very managerial in how they operate. So the next thinker we should talk about is a guy named Samuel Francis. I like Samuel Francis much more than I like James Burnham, because Francis was not ever a Trotskyist. He was not ever a neocon, and he wrote against these people with very harsh words. His book, which Parvini draws upon, is called Leviathan and Its Enemies. And it's also kind of like how Pareto wrote this giant tome of a book. Leviathan and Its Enemies is rather large. It's also hard to find a copy of. There are a lot of good points which Samuel Francis makes in this book, and he's particularly clued into racial issues. But unfortunately, those aren't what Parvini talks about in the Populist Delusion. Specifically for the Populist Delusion, Parvini zeroes in on how Samuel Francis identified a third type of manager. And this we can call managers in media. So we've already talked about bureaucrats who are managers in government, and like CEOs, board members, HR reps, who are managers in industry. Well, Samuel Francis added a third category to these, which are the managers in media. These are the people in charge of not just news programs like Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, really any kind of media. It could be a newspaper, it could be a television network, it could be anything. So Francis identified that these managers work to ensure total social dominance of their ideology. Francis believed that not everyone who was a manager in media believed the ideology they professed, but that they pushed it because it accrued them more power. And if we want an example of this, we can think of trans ideology. Sam Francis would say that if he were alive today, he would observe how all of this trans bullshit got pushed, how everyone in the media was complicit in it, and he would say that not everyone thought that you could really become the opposite gender. In fact, he would say that most people would think this is ludicrous, but they still pushed it because it was politically advantageous for them. I want to slightly disagree and slightly share my own opinions. I think a lot of these managers in media have a certain animus for the population. Frankly, a lot of them are of Jewish origin, living in white countries, and they have an animus against the white population. And they know that by promoting stuff like trans ideology, diversity, equity, and inclusion, interracial marriage in adverts and stuff like this, they know that they're destroying the white nations that they're in. I think that it's very important to remember the ethnic animus of these managers in media and, frankly, call out who they are, what are their origins. I don't think just saying that they don't believe it is good enough. I think we need to address that they do hate the people whose country they reside in, and they want to see them destroyed. Now, that brings us to the last thinker of the book, which Parvini writes about, and this guy is named Paul Gottfried. Paul Gottfried is Jewish, and so obviously I'm skeptical about trusting him. It's worth noting that Paul Gottfried has criticized the anti-whiteism and gotten shunned for it by his fellow Jews, but that's not enough to make me trust a person. I think that you could argue he's doing this out of self-preservation, and he's also, he pushes a certain lie about a mid-century event that happened in history. I won't say anymore because I'm still on YouTube. Anyway, regardless of my problems with Gottfried, we do have to talk about his ideas since he's in the book. He wrote a book called Multiculturalism and the Politics of Guilt. And during this book, the key concept that Neema Parvini talks about in the Populist Delusion is how Gottfried believed that there was a pathologization of wrongthink happening in our societies. Now, this is actually pretty hard to disagree with, because the state essentially says that those who dissent from the approved political narratives are wrong, and that they're not just wrong, they're in need of re-education and by means of social conditioning. Gottfried specifically talked about how science was used to achieve this. He says that science is not objective and it is beholden to politics. That's pretty easy to see. We can look at the COVID epidemic. We can look at all of these scientists who, hey, they knew that there were only two genders for the longest time until it became politically useful for left wingers to say that there were more. And specifically, we can look at subversive scientists like Bill Nye. Those of you who grew up in the early 2000s and the late 90s, you'll know that Bill Nye, he was a household name. He was regarded by many kids as a great scientist. But when 2016 came around and all of the transgender ideology really got off the ground, he made a redux of his show where he says that gender is on a spectrum and all of the lies that we've come to disdain. Science is not objective. It will always be beholden to politics. And we do need to get this idea that science is purely neutral. It's purely objective. This is a fiction. We have to get rid of it. We have to recognize that these scientists have ideas and they are going to push their own political ideas. And they're going, more importantly, they're going to use science as a way to justify it. Scientism is the word I'm looking for. So those are the 8 thinkers which Parvini writes about. So let's talk about why the book is so important to understand. I think the most important things to understand are the earlier chapters in the book, where we're talking about Italian elite theory. It's a strong argument against democracy, and it explains why democracy is wrong. We can't rely on democratic mechanisms to fix the problems we're in because democracy is incapable of fixing these problems, frankly. We can't go back to trite, overused normicon talking points and believe that we can just elect representatives who will speak truth to power, who will go to Washington and sort this all out. Trump is not going to be the Caesar figure who saves us all. Moreover, we have to dispense with ideas such as the separation of powers. This is a fiction. There will always be a convergence of power. And we have to really consider the idea of a counter elite. There's not going to be this mass. Let me rephrase that. We're not going to win politically by just waking all of the normies up and red pilling them. We're going to need an organized counter elite that is capable of asserting their will and using the levers of power. This should be our primary focus. We should be focused on building rather than just red pilling normies. Frankly, if 2020 didn't red pill them in the years since then, I'm skeptical that they can even be red pilled at all. We can keep pushing our talking points on Twitter. That's fine and good. I don't oppose that. But we just have to recognize that an organized minority will. The only thing that can dislodge an organized minority is a counter organized minority. It won't be this mass populist uprising that fixes things. It will be people getting organized and maneuvering as elites and efficient operators. So that's all I really wanted to talk about in this book. It doesn't look like we have many questions in the chat. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them, obviously, before we go. That's really it. I think this book is an important read for the reasons I mentioned. And it's also a very short read. It's not hard to read at all. It's in very common language, so anyone can really pick this up. It's not like Julius Evola, where every sentence he's using 1,000 commas, and it's very annoying. Parvini's writing style is a lot more accessible, and I would highly encourage those of you who want to understand Italian elite theory to read this book and take notes in the margins. That's something that I really stress people do because it is so useful. I know that if I didn't take notes in the margins of my books, I wouldn't understand the concepts being put forth nearly as well. And moreover, I'd like to reiterate that when we read books, we're not meant to speed read them. It's important to let the ideas presented digest and really chew on these ideas and think about what's being said and whether or not they're accurate. So for this book, we talked about how Burnham, he had some problems with his Trotskyist worldview. We talked about how Parvini didn't go into racial questions as much as I would have liked him to. And that's really something that comes when you don't speed read a book and when you really take the time to understand what Parvini is saying or what an author is saying, and then make up your mind of, is this right? What would I have done differently? And obviously, whether you agree or disagree. So it's a bit of a shorter stream tonight. That's all I've wanted to say. Oh, looks like we got a question. Monster Fan says, is one of the reasons for pushing trans ideology to widen the classes of people that could be used in the manager's satanic perversions and activities? I don't really think so, Monster Fan. I think it is more of just perversion from that certain ethnic group, and specifically it being weaponized against another ethnic group, which is ours. It's specifically people like that doctor. The trans stuff came from Magnus Hirschfeld in the 1930s. He was really doing that because he wanted to pervert and defile the German nation. Obviously, when the National Socialists came to power, they put a stop to that. But really, since then, all of the trans scientists and the people who push it, I think they're not trying to widen the pool of people who can be subversive. They're trying to defile, frankly, white men's daughters and white men's sons. That's what they're doing, and that's why I believe they push it. So that really wraps up everything I wanted to say. We'll get out of here a little sooner than I expected. Thank you all so much for watching. Next week, I believe we'll be discussing Storm of Steel. If you want to check the schedule for what we're reading, it's on my Twitter. I have it pinned. So you can go there and all of the books will be listed. I want to thank you all again for coming and for listening to this, and we will see you all next time.